So, hello everybody. Thanks for connecting and welcome to the Geneva Macro Labs online talk, A Virus Tests Democracy and Economic Growth. My name is Renate Guenther and I have the pleasure to be the Vice President and one of the co-founders of the Geneva Macro Labs. I will be moderating this online talk today together with our other co-founder and our President, Ekkehard Ernst. For those who don't know the Geneva Macro Labs yet, we are a do tank that combines a research think tank with a multi-stakeholder exchange platform to leverage the unique institutional, financial and human capital of the Lake Geneva area and beyond. We bring leading minds together from the public and the private sector, as well as from civil society, for example, through these weekly webinars to help achieve sustainable development. So, what's on the agenda today? We will have two presentations. The first is about coronavirus and the economic and the geoeconomic fallout by Robert Ward. Robert is the Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And the second presentation is about economic and the institutional impact of COVID-19 in Central and Eastern Europe by Marina Grusevaja. Marina is a professor at the Wiesbaden Business School. And we will have the usual question and answer session and an open discussion afterwards. Some housekeeping rules. Please feel free to comment and post your questions into the Zoom chat tool already now. You can find the chat tool on the bottom of your screen. Please mute yourself if you are not speaking because you want to avoid possible background noise. This webinar will be recorded, so you can review it in case or share it with your network. Before I hand over to our first speaker, I have a question for all of you. In which country are you currently located? Please comment in the chat tool to help us understand how international our audience is. And also, please give us feedback about the Geneva Macro Labs. We have a link in the chat tool. We are doing a survey on SurveyMonkey. That would be good to hear from you. We now have the chance to listen to our first speaker, Robert Ward, and it's a particular pleasure for me, as Robert and I were colleagues at the Economist Intelligence Unit, and we had the chance to travel a lot together throughout Europe. At that time, Robert was the editorial director of the Economist Intelligence Unit and impressed our clients with his presentations. Robert is now the Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy and Senior Fellow for Japanese Security Studies at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And Robert, I'd like to hand over to you now. May I ask you to unmute your microphone? We will share your presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Renate, and we're just going to get the presentation on the screen. Is the presentation coming up on the screen?
It's coming up on the screen. 1 second, please.
Fantastic. Well, just to say, fantastic. So when Renate asked me if I'd do this, I thought fantastic opportunity to work with Renate again after all these years. Our fun times in Germany are never forgotten. People often don't, when I start talking about them, people often don't believe that we actually got up to these things, these adventures in Germany on trains and other things to be continued another time. So, and great to see everybody, the sort of range of countries that everybody's in as well. So that's absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the global context of the crisis that we're in at the moment, and try to make some links with how I think the world economy is going to perform over the next couple of years, what that means for politics as well. I mean, we can see all sorts of things happening in the world politically, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in the US, all sorts of unrest and destabilizing things. That's one thing, and the other point is about the geopolitical, geoeconomic side to this. And apparently I have 10 minutes to talk about all of this, so I will canter through as quickly as I can and as clearly as I can, but we have Q&A obviously afterwards, so do ask questions. So coronavirus, the economic and geo-economic fallout. So could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Perfect. So one thing to understand, and this doesn't, one can't repeat this often enough, is this is an extraordinary shock to the global economy. In the UK, for example, we're looking at perhaps the worst economic performance, certainly amongst developed countries, for all sorts of reasons, but perhaps the worst economic performance since the 1700s. So this is for 300 years in peacetime. So for every single country, every single region of the world will contract this year. That's unusual. Even India, the fast-growing country, usually India will also contract. China will barely grow, officially at least, and perhaps unofficially it is also likely to contract. I got this chart here for you from the World Bank, and they've kindly given the data right back to 1961. This is the global GDP growth rate. And if you look from 1961, the fast growth as Germany, France, US, all these countries were growing very quickly. And then you have a sort of imperceptible sort of downtick in the pace of growth as you have the various crises, the oil shock in the 70s, you can see the dip down there between 73, 75, the 1980s slowdown. But then if you look at 2009, this is the great financial crash. And then you look at 2020, you can see that certainly what the World Bank is forecasting, and I think that's realistic, is worse than in 2008. And of course, this is unique crisis in so many ways as well. It's the first crisis really to come from nature. It's the first crisis to be driven by a government clampdown on the economy. The government's sort of willingly shutting down economies. It's one of the first crises, of course, that doesn't originate in the financial sector as well. I think one of the key, if you look at the figure for 2020, it is so dislocating that I think it's unreasonable to expect, well, two things. One is unreasonable to expect a V-shaped recovery. I think the V-shaped recovery brigade, we saw a lot of reportage about how there will be a quick snapback in terms of private consumption after people got their confidence back. Given the scarring that we're likely to get in pretty much every single major economy, by which I mean long-term unemployment, by which I mean confidence effects, by which I mean uncertain business climate and so on, I think a V-shaped recovery, so a very quick shaped recovery, is highly unlikely. This chart, this is the World Bank's, IMF's rather, forecasts, and it looks like a V-shaped recovery there in the chart, but actually it's not. It's more of a U-shaped recovery, and I think the U would be the optimistic outturn. So we have a deep downturn this year, we have stabilization next year, and we have a sort of return to the levels of 2019, probably in 2022. For some countries, it may take a bit longer. And the risk here, of course, is around politics as well. So the economy is one thing, but around politics too. And I was looking at the OECD real income per head charts the other day, and it was absolutely shocking what they're forecasting. They've got two scenarios, one sort of main central scenario and one worst case scenario. And in both scenarios, you see real income per head in the median OECD economy falling quite sharply this year and really not regaining its trajectory over the next few years. And this, as we saw with 2008, political unrest generally comes with a lag. So in 2008, we had the great financial crash, and then political unrest in Europe started about 4 or 5 years later. This time, however, I think the lag the pass-through will be quite fast, because the global economy goes into this in a weakened economic state, of course, but also in a very fragmented political state. And also there's all sorts of issues with taxation and government policy going forward, all of which I think will tend to polarize politics. So what I'm calling Bernie by the back door in some countries. So which of course Bernie Sanders in the US with his sort of more left-wing agenda. I think the economics will lean probably towards the left of the spectrum with more government intervention. But the politics, I suspect, will lean to the right in many countries. Can we have the next slide, please? This is around trade, and for the EU and for many parts of Asia, the Middle East, and so on. A lot of these economies are very open economies, and so will be hit very badly by the collapse in global trade. The world economy is being hit by a sort of simultaneous supply shock and demand shock. And it's easier to start supply because that's more mechanistic. It's more difficult to start demand, but obviously trade depends on people wanting things. So this is the World Trade Organization's forecasts again for global trade volumes, and it's a pretty standard slide, I think, but it shows a very important thing, and that is the trend rate from 1990 to 2008. The dotted line there coming up from around just under 60. That was what we were going to have until the global financial crisis hit, and then the blue line shows a downtick in global trade volumes, and then a recovery as you'd hope. But if you look at the angle of that line, it's lower than the dotted line was. So what that means is the global economy had such a significant hit to it that the productive capacity, the ability to generate wealth was actually permanently dislocated. And if you look at the green line and then the red line, this is what the WTO is thinking. Green line is their central scenario and red line is their bad scenario. Again, you know, the risk here, I think, is that we have a downward, the shock is so great that we have a permanent downward trajectory adjustment again in the world's ability to grow, here expressed in trade terms. Unfortunately, hanging over global trade, and this is where the geoeconomics bit comes in, is protectionism. You see nationalism, what I'm calling sort of medical nationalism, the race to develop the vaccine, all separate countries all trying to get their vaccine in first. You see nationalism rising in China becoming much more aggressive externally, particularly in Asia, destabilizing Southeast Asia, probing Japanese territory as well. And of course you have China versus the US. This crisis has really turbocharged China-US friction. And if you think back just a few short months ago to the phase 1 trade deal, and between the US and China, what a long time ago that seems now. I think that's going to be impossible to fulfill for China, and of course the US with its presidential election coming up very soon. It's in Trump's interest to keep sort of punching this particular bruise. So again, the threat of nationalism, I think, and protectionism and fragmentation is very high. We'll talk a little bit about supply chains, I think, a bit later in perhaps some of the questions. But again, one of the things to focus on here is decoupling. Do we have full decoupling? I suspect that's not possible, although there will be selective decoupling in certain industries. But again, this is all bad news for globalization as trade becomes more, as supply chains become more regional, more local, and the high point of globalization is probably past. Can we have the next slide, please? This chart is just, every time I look at it, my heart starts to beat fast, and then I feel quite ill. This is the scarring I was talking about. This is the US unemployment insurance claims. This is the first week that it shot up, and you can see just what a shock to the US system this is. This is being repeated in every single country to a greater or lesser extent. Clearly, the US market is very flexible, so it's worse sort of aggravated here. That flexibility aggravates the unemployment, but this sort of thing feeds the political unrest and the political discontent that I was talking about, and the divisions in societies that I was talking about. And this is as I said, the scarring will be when this unemployment number doesn't really come down as quickly as governments would hope. Doesn't mean that industry is completely blighted forever, because obviously certain industries are doing very well. As if you're in data, if you're in AI, if you're in tech, if you're online retail, these areas are all doing pretty well. But if you're in retail and hospitality, the return to normalcy, whatever that may mean, is going to be quite difficult. And got two more slides, which I will scamper through very quickly so I don't take up Marina's time. This is oil, and very, if you're an oil producer, so we've been talking largely about the developed world now, hitherto in the previous slides. This is oil. So if you're in the Middle East, or if you're in Nigeria or Vietnam, Malaysia, other oil producing countries, oil prices right rock bottom at the moment. My view is that oil prices over the longer term, it's structurally in decline, this industry is. So yes, we may be going to use more oil because it's cheap in the short term, but structurally it is in decline, and the energy transition is underway. So if you're an oil producer, if you're a commodities producer of certain industries, for certain industries where which are going to be hit by this, particularly in the emerging markets, this is all very bad news for you. And the last slide, please. And a very important point here, why I think U is a optimistic scenario. L is the one, the L-shaped recovery is the one that we don't want, because it in effect means a depression, and V is too optimistic in my view. One important difference between now and 2008, the aftermath of 2008, is that China cannot lead the world into recovery this time as it did then. In 2009, after the great crash, China implemented the mother of all stimulus packages, about 15% of GDP. Nothing like it had ever been seen in the world before. This has left China with a lot of debt. As you can see, great slide here from the BIS, Bank for International Settlements. The red line is China. This is their big debt, private sector debt in the economy. Goes right back to 1984. You can see that in terms of the percentage of Chinese debt in the economy, it's now not dissimilar to when Spain had the peak of Spain's bubble in the last decade, or even Japan's bubble at the end of the 1980s. So China, for a developing economy, its debt level is very, very high indeed. So its fiscal capacity to spend and to sort of pull the world out of this is very much reduced. So I think to conclude, we're looking at a very muted medium term trajectory for the world economy, and this will aggravate existing geoeconomic stresses, and aggravate, I think, political unrest, and particularly with regard to distrust in institutions. I think that's something to watch going forward. So with that, I will conclude and hand back to the chair.
Thank you so much, Robert, for the usual outstanding presentation. So I understand the future is wide open, and other than in 2008, China cannot lead us out of the crisis. And there might be also some political unrest. So yeah, we have more information, I think, for more webinars to come. I now have the great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Marina Grusevaja. Marina started her career in Germany. After finishing her PhD, Marina worked at the Institute for Economic Research in Halle, where she led the research group of institutional convergence and participated in different projects funded by the European Commission. In 2014, Marina became full professor of the economics at the Wiesbaden Business School, and since 2015, she's also the head and co-founder of the Wiesbaden Institute for Law and Economics. Marina, we are looking forward to your presentation. May I ask you to unmute your microphone? We will share your presentation. Marina, you have the floor.
Renate, thank you very much. Thank all of you for this opportunity to share with you some information on Central Eastern Europe. So now I'm going to share my screen with you. That is the wrong slide. We start with the first one. Okay, so I would like to start with the first slide, and I don't want to repeat what we just heard about the global situation and global impact. I would like to focus in my presentation on the Central Eastern European only, and the situation in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. They are well, at least right now, they look a little bit, the situation look a little bit different. So we have a lower total number of cases. If you can see, well, here is not the whole Central Eastern Europe, just some selected countries, but you can see here the you can see the countries here on the, there's the EU member states, and then below you can you see 3 of the countries which do not belong to the European Union. And we can see a significant difference between the numbers, and also the death cases are much more lower than we know from our well, experience from Europe, United States, and from other parts of the world. So it seems like the Central Eastern Europe is less affected by global pandemic. Well, we do not yet know exactly the reasons for this. We have some explanation. There is some of the ideas why it's this way. But no really exact data. What is interesting, and I mentioned this just here, this is official reported data, because we don't know, in some of the cases the data is not reliable. If we talk about Ukraine, Russia, in particular Belarus. So maybe Belarus, I would like to mention, I'm originally from Belarus. I was born and grew up in Belarus, so it is my home country, but then I moved to Germany. So I look from time to time in the numbers and the situation in this country well, as well. So, and we can see here that there is a difference, and maybe someone would say, okay, if there is less impact in terms of infection numbers, so it is lower infection spread around those countries. So might be that we would have a different economic impact. So we probably would expect these countries to face less strong downturn, and well, maybe to recover a little bit faster than other countries which still have to handle the high number of cases. So, okay, here you can see, of course, that the cases in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, they are not very low. Well, this one of the explanation is there's much more few measures and against the spread of the infection, and some of the measures they were implemented quite late. So we see this result, but the numbers here on the right side of death cases is quite low as well. So, but I don't want to look so much in the numbers of the disease, of the pandemic, but to look rather on the expected economic impact. Here is the forecast of the Vienna Institute of International Economic Studies, the last one from the May 2020. So as you can see, here are all countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and you can see that the impact is also quite different. So we have here on the top the European Central Eastern Europe EU member states, there are 11 of them. So we have here the numbers in red from for this year, 2020, and some projection the next year. So you can see here all the numbers are in red, but there are also some differences. For example, Poland, we can see we expect the economic decline around -4%, while, for example, in Croatia, the expected impact is going to be around -11%. Well, the long-term, middle-term expectations are quite positive, which means that the countries, they would go back to the previous positive development, but of course not immediately, because all the numbers here forecast for 2020-21, they are lower than the decline, the economic decline in 2020. So the question is why we have these differences in the impact. So we cannot put all the countries in the same basket and to say all of them are facing the downturn in this similar way. Well, there are different reasons. The first, one of the factors that is dependency from the FDI. So some of the countries, they are extremely dependent on FDI, and of course, as long as the world is struggling with the pandemic, there will be no fast recovery, and of course, the also financial resources, they will be rather used for their own country than spent in other countries for any kind of investment. So those countries which depend on FDI, and in this case, they are most of the EU member states, so which means this from Central Eastern Europe, they are going to have a quite strong impact of the pandemic, of the global pandemic. While here, if we look in the Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, we have a lower impact compared to some of the countries here above. The another factor is, which was mentioned already before, that is the fiscal capacity. The states have different fiscal capacity to respond to the crisis and to support, first of all, of course, the domestic economy, but then maybe as to substitute also the investments, fall away from the private actors, and also there is no enough sources to boost the domestic demand. So, which means if the state is financially well equipped, we will have a stronger or faster recovery. If it's not well equipped, it would be take longer to recover. And and the third factor, of course, is dependency on exports. So we have FDI and exports, of course. Many of those countries, particularly again the Central and Eastern European countries, as the EU member states, they quite heavily depend on exports. While, for example, the countries that we see here, they are rather close. They have closed economies. Not some of them are quite poor, like Ukraine. They do not have now the high export capacity, which means that they also do not depend so much on the global recovery in these terms. Of course, they're affected by the global recovery, but there is a wide difference between them. Now I would like to have a look in the institutional impact, and we do not have yet any new studies on this. That's why I present you the studies from the previous years, and maybe we can draw some conclusions from this. This is first kind of approach to see in the institutional impact. We heard in the previous presentation about the democracy and the development of democracy around the world. We can measure, I would say, the democracy with the World Bank governance indicators, which includes these factors like voice and accountability, regulatory quality, rule of law, corruption, political stability, and government effectiveness. So, and we can see for the countries, first of all, Central and Eastern European countries which joined the European Union in 2004. There are 8 countries. We can see the development for these different areas, or these different indicators. And what we can see, there were a lot of efforts. So this line is the year 2004, the year they joined the European Union. So we have before this line a kind of mixed results, but a kind of, well, we would say consolidation or maybe convergence. So they come closer together in terms of voice accountability, regulatory quality, or a little bit more differences we see the rule of law, but is a kind of positive impact. But afterwards we see a quite mixed picture. The red line here, this is Hungary. So we know exactly this voice and accountability is a particular story in Hungary. Also rule of law. So we have a very strong decline after EU enlargement of 2004. But all the other countries also, we do not have much progress. So we do not see a lot of improvements after the 2004, even if we have already like 15 years passed, but there is no much improvement, and rather, well, other different developments. So in the next slide, we see the same pictures for the three countries that joined the European Union later, in 2007, Bulgaria and Romania, and in 2013, the Croatia. Croatia is the blue line. The other two are quite close. The Bulgaria and Romania are close to each other. We can see here also the similar pictures, the quite well, impressive improvements in some of the indicators, like regulatory quality, for example, is really very positive improvement before EU enlargement. And here, this line is the line from the Bulgaria and Romania. The blue line is the line for Croatia. And then afterwards, we have or stagnation, or in some, for some of the indicators also decline. For example, government effectiveness is slowing down in one of the countries, it's Bulgaria in this case. Also, here political stability is give us a quite mixed picture. So I would like to compare, as I started already, not to talk just about the EU member state, but also the Eastern European countries outside the EU. Here the comparison of well, Russia and Ukraine in this case, and some of the EU member states like Poland, Czech Republic and Hungary. And we can see the lower two lines, they are Ukraine and Russia, and the upper lines, they are the three EU member states. So we have differences, and we have again here, well, the situation that we couldn't see a lot of, or a strong improvement in World Bank governance indicators. In some cases, even the political stability decrease over the time. So what doesn't see us? Now, of course, the world is put in a particular situation. First of all, we have to struggle with economic downturn. We have, or fallout, we can see. So we have to recover the economies around the world. It is already a very difficult task also for very well-developed countries, or for leading countries. We heard that China is not going to play the important part in the recovery, as it is not possible, not able to do so. So what is going to happen in the Central Eastern Europe? That is a very good question, because we have now this situation that on one hand, we want to have a strong state, which is taking the measure and implement them even against the will of the population in some of the countries, or the strong government like in Belarus, Russia, which is not doing anything, just waiting and reacting, well, way too late to some of the events. But the unsatisfaction in the population grows on both sides. So it's not just in one country and another not. We have this well, growing mistrust to the governmental measures and to strong government. And we can observe this in many countries around the world. And on the same, in this situation, we have, of course, well, a kind of it's difficult to predict how the political stability will be affected in those countries which were already not very stable before the crisis occurred, but also the government effectiveness. It could be that we move from government effectiveness towards the strong government, which is going to implement everything against the will of the population, which is not going to have a good impact on overall recovery of those countries. So I would like now to conclude on this, after all these slides. The first of all, the economic and institutional impact is different in different countries, particularly in this region. There are huge differences. And the economic recovery, well, probably it's valid for all the countries around the world. Fiscal capacity is, of course, very important, but also the exports and FDI. They also built a kind of core for some of the countries, and those countries are going to suffer more. For example, countries which depend on tourism, for example, they are going to face a stronger economic decline. And how we are going to deal with all this situation, of course, depends on effectiveness of the government, and which means that the institutional impact is difficult to predict. So we have on one hand the stronger trust in some of the Central and Eastern European states. They trust the government is able to take the right decision. And on the other hand, we have the increasing mistrust in the same governments. And it might lead to the very strong movement away from democratic structure towards more rigid principles to govern the economies. And of course, depending on this, we will see how fast the countries will recover overall. So that's why I think as the last word that institutional impact that will determine the pace of economic recovery in Central and Eastern Europe. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marina, for your great presentation. So I understand really the recovery from the pandemic will depend on certain factors like the FDI, on also the fiscal capacity of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And the crisis hit already a fragile economy and political situation. So I already saw a lot of questions coming in, and I would like to hand over now to our President, Ekkehard Ernst, who will lead the Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you, Renate, and thank you very much to both speakers, Robert and Marina. Excellent presentation, very insightful. And as Renate said, we already have a number of interesting and I would say even challenging questions. So I wanted to make sure that we have enough time to really cover all the different topics that our community would like to touch upon. And so I would like to, when I give the floor to some of you, I would like to you to stick to the specific points that you want to raise, because I would like to start first and foremost with the specific exit possibilities of the crisis. I think both of you have touched upon it, and I would like Ivan to maybe pose ask his first question to our two speakers.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks again, Geneva, for hosting this excellent webinar. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Marina. Second of all, quick excuse for my disheveled demeanor, but I had to squeeze in a quick 5K run. Robert, to you then. So one theory is that in terms of macroeconomics, the coordination to get out of this crisis is particularly because we have both the supply and the demand shock, right? I think you very aptly reiterated the fact that it's much broader than that, so thank you for that. But do you also see other coordination challenges that are particular to this a crisis? For example, international cooperation in the medical field, international organizations, etc., etc. Thank you.
You have to unmute, Robert.
Brilliant, thank you. That's a great question, because one of the concerns I think we should all have is the ability of the world to really come together. I mean, this is a global problem that needs a global solution, and you only have to compare and contrast the 2008 response with the response this time. 2008, after the great financial crisis, you had the birth of the G20. You had a really concerted effort to try to sort of pull things together, and you had the US obviously playing a really important leading role there. Fast forward to 2020, and you know the US is the chair of the G7 at the moment. You'd never know, given how quiet they've been. Rather, you have this sort of pulling away from multilateral institutions, which I think is incredibly dangerous. Notwithstanding that many of these institutions have problems. I mean, no one would argue that the WHO, for example, is problem-free. But at the very time that we need everybody to pull together, you have fragmentation globally. Also fragmentation, you know, within the EU, for example. I think that is very worrying for the stability of the EU going forward. The fiscal stresses, for example, between the South and the North, I mean, these have been around for many, many years. But this sort of intense pandemic, of course, makes them really, really acute. And then you have in the background, as we've been talking about, the Cold War, call it what you will, between China and the US, which of course aggravates problems with globalization, problems with protectionism, nationalism that we've been talking about. So that's, I think, on the coordination front, that's the real risk. And the other thing that's going to make this crisis quite difficult to get out of is the hit to sentiment. So as I said at the beginning, you know, it's very easy to start up factories and start producing things and so on if your supply chains allow. But it is very difficult to persuade people who are frightened of being infected by the virus or have concerns about vulnerable people at home to go out and spend if they don't want to. And I think this is something that we should watch very carefully. You know, what is the hit to sentiment? And ultimately things do sort of do normalize up to an extent, but how quickly does that happen?
Thank you very much, Robert. We have a couple of questions from our audience also about the role of the US, the tension basically between the US and China, and how these tensions might prevent either country or both actually to step up and help the global economy to recover. Maybe Daniel, you want to bring forward your question? Do you have to both Marina and Robert?
Yes, thank you very much, Ekkehard, and thank you very much to both presenters for two great presentations. My question was exactly that. It was maybe directed a little bit more to Robert, but I would also be happy to hear Marina's view on that. What is the role of the US and China after the crisis? Especially because we can see that China is making lots of efforts to present itself a little bit as a role model. They want to show that they were very efficient in responding to the health crisis. At the same time, they have made efforts to assume responsibilities. They have delivered you know, aid to other countries, including Europe. And on the other hand, you have the US, who looks a little bit overwhelmed from time to time. Surprised sometimes, and they also make clear that they do not want to take over this leadership role that they traditionally had over the last decades. Is China actually becoming the geopolitical winner out of this crisis? What do you think?
Well, I mean, the China-US relationship will affect us all. So wherever we are, big countries, small countries, this is one of the fundamental relationships we have to watch going forward, obviously, because both these countries are so large. So Xi Jinping started off, China's leader, President Xi Jinping started off with started this pandemic very badly, hiding information and so on. So he had a sort of potential Chernobyl moment back in 1986, of course. The Chernobyl explosion was one of the things that sort of undercut Gorbachev. And the discussion was, is this going to be the same for Xi Jinping? Xi Jinping, in a sense, has been fortunate because other countries, perhaps not naming names, have actually managed the crisis potentially worse than China did in the initial phases. And Xi Jinping will point to China's ability to sort of clamp down a bit later in sort of January, February time, and to bring this under control. So he's claiming this as a triumph for China, and as you say, sort of pushing out on the PR campaign to try to drum up support for China's support for healthcare, for example, financial support, all of that. Xi Jinping has even revived his ambition for a healthcare Silk Road, in which China is a sort of supporter of and director of healthcare, particularly in the emerging markets. I don't think if there's a Democrat win in November, that makes much difference. Actually, I think the Chinese, in a sense, would prefer Donald Trump to win because he's a known quantity. But the feeling against China, the identification of China as a strategic threat to the US is bipartisan now. So whether it's Biden, whether it's Trump, I think the relationship is going to be pretty rocky going forward. Has China won? I don't think so. I think China has, you know, the thing about China is its strategic opportunism. It's seen a sort of little gap in the market where it can make some good PR, but you've got to think about the weaknesses in China. China has an aging population, a declining growth rate, very large amounts of debt, industries that are not productive. So China is a lot weaker than it looks. And also part of the problem, of course, with China's behavior more generally is it sort of crystallizes concerns, particularly in the West, about about what a threat it is. So I think too easy to say who's won so far, too early rather to say who's won, but I think China is a lot weaker than sometimes it's made out to be.
Thank you, Robert. Marina, do you want to add something on the specific role of China in Eastern Europe? Especially, we have seen China having making inroads in Southeastern Europe over the last few years? Something you want to add to that?
Yes, I would like to add something at exactly the point that China started to intervene in Europe. Well, first with one Belt, One Road initiative. But what I think, what is a bigger danger, so we have now these two big countries, which of course are very important for the overall recovery. So we have United States and we have the China. And we look first on the recovery, and of course I agree absolutely that China is weaker. But for many countries of the post-Sovietic bloc, of the socialistic bloc, they are kind of disappointed that the economic development is not comparable to the Western Europe or United States after they joined the European Union and other countries as well. So they started recently to look at the China as a new model of the governance. So they started to look, and we see now so the differences. On one hand, we have China, and on the other hand, we have United States. And in the United States, the number of cases are just going up. And we have China, on the other hand, which probably is not reporting the real number of cases, but still lower than any other countries. And everybody is just surprised how it is possible. And then the government, the message of the government is that's because we are able to do this, and which means that the form of having the autocratic regime, the political regime, might be more promising and successful if we move towards economic development and also economic recovery. And I think that is a big danger that some of the countries, they might just follow the example of China and go away from democratic structure, from the governance indicators that we measure, like rule of law, and they would move towards more strong direction, strong government and the strong leader of the government, because the economy doesn't obviously suffer so much. So that's why I think that is major point. Now, it's not just about who is going to play the economic role, but rather what would be the model for the political development in the future in a quite big part of countries in the world.
Thank you, Marina. That's excellent. And it's actually an excellent transition to our next group of questions. We have a couple of questions on the institutional side, and especially on this kind of top-level discussion, democracy versus command economy, which one works best? Dr. Badawi, do you want to ask your question directly? You have to unmute. You have to unmute yourself, yes.
Thank you. I believe that there's a strong presence of China in Africa as well. There are so many despotic regimes, and they have supported military dictators there. So we see a model emerging of the Chinese strategy. Is it possible? Same thing to more vulnerable countries in Europe and Asia, if the democratic powers do not couple up and make a strength to counter such kind of efforts to stop the economy from getting blackmailed sort of things because of the command nature of the Chinese governments. Can I say? Yeah.
Yeah. Did you get these questions? Yeah. I mean, basically the question was, what works best? Is it a more decentralized or a command control system that works best? Maybe if you want to start, Marina, and then I give back to Robert.
Okay, I can start. I'll mute myself. Well, it is a good question, but we cannot really respond it just with one word. What is better? It depends, of course, what we compare and what outcomes you would like to reach. So if we look at the whole situation, if we look just on the economic growth, as it was common in the past, that we just would like to grow and then we can improve the living situation of the population and the welfare and so on. Then we have now quite ambiguous situation because we see that it's possible to grow economically without having a democracy. in case of China. So you can have a kind of common regime or a part of this, not completely. You can combine this with some of well, economical principles, and then you can have the same outcome and quite impressive growth. Of course, China is still developing countries, but if you look at the last, I think like 10 years, it is very impressive what has been possible in China. So at the same time, we look in the other direction, we see the democracy is nice and participation in governmental structures, and maybe well, the voice and accountability is very, very nice and important, of course, as a value. But on the other hand, we see that all the countries that have, they struggle with different issues in terms of economic development. The old world started to grow slowly. Now we have actually the chance with this pandemic to show that democracies are more flexible and are able to give the chance to recover faster than the common regime. But I think we cannot now say what would be outcome, because it is it's quite it started to be quite attractive to look at the China and to see we don't need democracy to be economically successful. So, and we have really to pay attention on this and not just on the pace of the economic recovery, I think.
Thank you. Robert?
So kind of echo some of what Marina said. With, I think the distinguishing features of a democracy is that you can learn, there's no barrier really to learning from mistakes. So in China, of course, because of Xi Jinping's sort of centrality to everything pretty much, given his centrality in the constitution itself, the whole thing revolves around him. So if things go wrong, clearly it's in the interest of his longevity to try to hide them, to blame other people, just to sort of keep the ship steady for whatever he wants it to do. I think with democracies, clearly that's more difficult. So yes, democracies make mistakes, and we're seeing that in spades all around Europe. I mean, governments do make mistakes. This is a almost impossible thing to deal with without making mistakes. But I think the distinguishing point about a democracy is that there are no barriers, as I said, to learning from those mistakes and moving on. There's no sort of personification around one person like there is, for example, in China or Russia, for example. Putin, clearly everything's directed at his sort of 2024 problem. He wants to stay in office for a long, long time. And that, again, distorts policy, distorts transparency, and so on. With regard to the model, the Chinese model, which Marina rightly cites, this is a sort of deceptively attractive model, because yes, China has achieved things that are absolutely extraordinary, lifting people, millions, hundreds of millions out of poverty. You have first world level infrastructure there. Go to Beijing airport, it's as good as anything you'll ever see anywhere in the world. So they've achieved an enormous amount. But the challenge for China now, and I think this is where the challenge for China's top-down state capitalism economic model, the challenge is, can they loosen the system enough now to really to grow when the levers of growth are actually much more difficult to pull. So they don't need much more infrastructure. They can't export their way out of this crisis because world demands is far lower. So they have to be looking at accountability. They have to be looking at deepening financial markets. They have to be looking at potentially floating the renminbi, opening the capital account. All of these require the government to loosen its control on the economy. But of course, if it's run by one person that needs that control to stabilize his position, then that loosening is probably not going to be forthcoming. And this, I think, will weigh on China's growth ability going forward. So yes, 2001 to 2008, perhaps a bit beyond there, China did very well, but its command economy drove some of that. But I think now that sort of top-down approach is going to be very difficult for China to actually achieve the growth rates that it needs to grow its way out of debt, to look after its growing elderly population, for example, and so on. So a challenge for China.
Thank you, Robert. I think that's actually an excellent transition to one of our last questions that we can take tonight. And And Baptiste had that, which is to say that maybe this distinction between command and democracy is not appropriate. Maybe we need some new institution model. Baptiste, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. Yeah, thanks both of you for sharing all this interesting information and data. So I'm just wondering, this crisis show a lot of cases where we see a lot of conflict of interest between pharmaceutical private groups and sanitary authorities. And I am wondering how can people still have confidence in their public institutions and international institutions when they see that those groups are not representing their own interest. And I am wondering if the globalism will be impact in the future, and if we gonna return on more nationalism and protectionism. That's thanks for your answer.
Thank you. Robert, you want to go first?
Well, I mean, you've just put your finger on the real risk here, because distrust in institutions, certainly in the West, in political institutions, has been ongoing since the 1970s, accelerated by the response to the 2008 financial crash, the lack of wage growth, the fact that the bankers emerged unscathed pretty much, austerity in some countries as a result, all of these stresses, and these were all these all aggravated that distrust in institutions, and I think the failure of some governments to respond particularly well to this, the failure to get control of the narrative, the association of difficulties with the COVID response with perceived policy mistakes of the past, all of these things I think come together to create quite a potentially toxic cocktail. And when you have a government which has got problems at home, of course, then one very convenient way of getting out of that is by looking outside and just sort of creating a siege mentality. China's going through some of that at the moment as well, by the way. Xi Jinping is sort of battening down the hatches ahead of their big anniversary that they've got in the middle of next year, about the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, sort of siege mentality. And I think the risk is, to your point on globalization, that this sort of drives a trend that was already underway. This is not a new trend, but this sort of accelerates that fragmentation that we were talking about earlier.
Thank you. So I give for the final answer, I give the floor to Marina, but I would like to add one aspect to, if you can reflect that in your answer, which is besides the institutional change that we might or might not see in the future, what do you see about how does the lack of trust that we see in some countries of your region, how does it affect the possibility of some social unrest spreading from the US across the Atlantic towards Eastern Europe? Is there something that you see that you can already anticipate happening, or is that too early to say?
Well, thank you for this question. I think it is early to say if it's going to happen or not. What we see that the people around the world are getting more and more nervous. That is my impression. And first of all, the trust in some of the countries that the government would know the right way to deal with the crisis is disappearing, so in falling apart, we could say. There is no differences if what kind of political regime we have, if you have a democratic regime or autocratic regime, it's all the same. The people start to question the measures and the behavior and what the government is wanting in the end. We see this in Hungary, we see this in some other countries, Russia, for example. There are a lot of unrest coming up because the people, they do not trust the decisions of the government right now. First lockdown and now opening everything just right away without the pandemic and the spread of the pandemic stopped. So the people start to question this, and I think we will have a lot of energy which might influence the situation in different way, and probably you would get out with a new model of the governance, I don't know, which is in between the both models. I don't think so, because the democratic regime, I absolutely agree with Robert, it has the capacity to learn and the capacity to be flexible in different situations, because we can use the all the brains of the economy. The people can freely contribute if they want to. But we are now really in a very difficult situation, because also in the democracies the people stopped trusting the government, and in this case, of course, we could just move in the opposite direction. Well, we will see.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you very much for all your excellent questions to our two speakers. Thanks for the two speakers to be so insightful tonight with our community. I'm sorry if I have to cut it short here. We are already almost beyond the time, and we really respect your time. I want to make sure that we stick to the hour. I invite all of you who haven't seen their questions answered to kind of check out our YouTube channel and ask the questions there. We make sure that the questions reach the speakers, and we provide some answers to that. And so with that, I hand over to Renate for the final words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ekkehard. Thank you also for all your very good questions. Thank you to our distinguished speakers. I really enjoyed the conversation and the online talk today. We will publish the recorded webinar later this week on LinkedIn. Please join us next Wednesday again, when we talk about how the pandemic accelerates our digital future, a very important topic. And the week after, we will look at fiscal policy responses to COVID-19. And we will have a summer break from mid-July, and our last online talk will be on the 15th of July. And at that time, we will also include some art performance. So I invite you already to join us on the 15th of July. Hope to see many of you. In the meantime, please stay in touch with us. You can see the different channels, how to reach out to us on the slide. Please feel free to give us feedback on our webinars. Please fill in the survey. I just posted the link again in the chat. Comment on our posts on LinkedIn, and if you want to become a member of the Geneva Marco Labs, let us know. Or if you want to suggest topics like Gareth just did in the chat. I wish you a pleasant rest of the week. Stay healthy. Talk again next Wednesday, hopefully. And goodbye for now, everybody.